Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we have a long, dark episode made for people who like the strange, the mysterious, and the kind of true stories that stay in your head after the room goes quiet. So get comfortable, lower the lights, and maybe listen with one ear open. Before we begin, do me one small favor. Take the like button on a beautiful mountain vacation. Give it a warm jacket, hand it a tiny radio, tell it rescue is definitely coming, and then quietly change the channel to static for the next 72 days. Also, before you sleep tonight, check your doors, your windows, and anything that makes a weird sound after midnight. Now, imagine this. You are trapped inside the broken body of an airplane, high in the Andes Mountains, surrounded by nothing but white cliffs, frozen wind, and dead silence. Your skin is burned by the sun. Your bones ache from the cold. And for days, the only thing keeping you alive is the belief that someone somewhere is still looking for you. Then, the little radio in your hands finally catches a signal. The sound is weak, full of static, but you can still understand the voice of the announcer. And what he says is not that help is coming, it is not that helicopters are on the way. He says the official search has been called off because everyone on your flight is presumed dead. For a few seconds, nobody inside the wreckage speaks. The men just sit there, packed shoulder to shoulder in the torn open fuselage, listening to the wind scrape against the metal walls. That broadcast does not just take away their hope, it tells them something worse. In the eyes of the world, they are no longer missing. They are already ghosts. To understand how they reached that moment, we have to go back to October of 1972. A group of young rugby players from Uruguay were preparing for what should have been a simple trip to Chile. They were members of the Old Christians Club, a tight group of friends, teammates, brothers, and cousins who treated the journey more like an adventure than a risk. The plane was carrying 45 people, including players, relatives, friends, and crew. Inside the cabin, the mood was loud and careless in the way only young athletes can be careless. They joked, passed snacks around, leaned across seats to talk, and looked out the windows at the mountains below, not knowing those mountains were about to become their entire world. Bad weather forced delays and complicated the route. The Andes are not ordinary mountains. They are a wall of stone and snow with peaks so high they seem to cut into the sky. Flying over them required precision, patience, and good visibility. But that day, clouds swallowed the ridges, and the pilots had to trust their instruments more than their eyes. Somewhere over the mountain range, a fatal mistake happened. The pilots believed they had crossed safely past the highest peaks and had begun descending toward Chile. But in reality, the aircraft was still deep inside the mountains. Outside the windows, the clouds were thick and white, hiding the danger until the last possible second. Then the cloud cover broke just enough for the crew to see a ridge directly ahead. It was not far away. It was right there, rising in front of them like a wall. The pilots pulled back hard, trying to lift the aircraft over the mountain, but the plane was too low and moving too fast. The belly struck the snow and rock with a sound like the sky tearing open. The impact ripped away both wings and tore off the tail section. What remained of the fuselage became a violent metal sled, sliding down the glacier at terrifying speed. People were thrown from their seats, luggage exploded through the cabin. The world became screaming, twisting aluminum, until the wreckage finally slammed into a bank of snow and stopped. When the survivors opened their eyes, there was a strange silence. No airport, no road, no village, only snow stretching in every direction. The front of the plane had been crushed, the back was gone. Around them were injured friends, shattered seats, and the kind of cold that immediately finds its way through clothing, skin, and bone. At first, they believed rescue would come quickly. A plane had disappeared, families would raise alarms, search teams would be sent. So they did what survivors do in the first stage of disaster. They organized. They pulled the wounded together, used the fuselage as shelter-packed luggage against the open end, and waited for the sound of engines in the sky. But the mountains were working against them. The white fuselage blended into the glacier. The crash site was far from the expected route. From above, the wreckage did not look like wreckage. It looked like one more torn patch of snow in a landscape made entirely of snow. Search planes passed somewhere beyond them, but no one saw the tiny scar where they were trapped. Their food supply was almost nothing. A few chocolates, some wine, a little jam, small things meant for a short flight, not for survival at 11,000 feet. They divided everything into tiny portions, hoping to stretch the food until rescuers arrived. But each day, the portions became smaller and the sound of hunger became louder inside the cabin. The cold at night was merciless. The survivors slept pressed against each other not for comfort, but because body heat was the only thing standing between them and death. During the day, the sun reflected off the snow so brightly it burned their faces. They were freezing and burning at the same time in a place where the human body was never meant to remain. Then came the radio broadcast. After more than a week of waiting, they heard that the search had been suspended. No one was coming. The truth settled into the cabin slowly, like the cold itself. They could cry, pray, or rage, but none of it changed the facts. They were alone in the Andes with no food, no map, no proper clothing, and no way to call for help. This is where the story becomes almost impossible to imagine from the safety of a warm room. Hunger stopped being discomfort and became something physical, something that clouded their thoughts and weakened their muscles. They tried eating leather and scraps from the plain, but those things did nothing. The mountain had no plants, no animals, and no mercy. The only source of nourishment left was the one thing none of them wanted to think about. Outside the fuselage preserved by the snow were the bodies of people they had loved, friends, teammates, family members. The thought was horrifying. These were young men raised with faith rules and a deep respect for the dead. But the mountain had reduced morality to one question: live or disappear. They talked about it in low voices, with shame, grief, and desperation all tangled together. Eventually, they made a pact. If one of them died, the others had permission to use what remained so that at least someone might survive long enough to tell the world what happened. It was not a choice made from savagery. It was a choice made from love terror and the refusal to let everyone vanish. For a short time, that terrible decision kept them alive. But the Andes were not finished with them. On the 17th night, while the men were sleeping inside the fuselage, an avalanche came down the slope without warning. Tons of snow slammed over the wreckage and sealed the cabin shut, burying the survivors in darkness. Inside, the air began to run out. Men woke up choking, pinned under snow, and bodies unable to see their own hands. They dug upward with anything they could use, clawing through the packed snow to make a hole for air. By the time they opened a small breathing space, 8 more people were dead. The survivors had not just crashed in the mountains, they were being hunted by them. Weeks passed. Their bodies grew thinner, their voices became softer. Hope became less like a feeling and more like a discipline, something they had to choose every morning because the alternative was to lie down and never get up again. By December, they understood the final truth. If they waited in the wreckage, they would die there. One of the men, Nando Parado, had already lost his mother and sister because of the crash. Grief had hollowed him out, but it had also given him a strange kind of clarity. He decided that dying while walking was better than dying while waiting. Roberto Canessa, another survivor, agreed to go with him. They would head west toward what they hoped was Chile. They had no real climbing gear. Their clothes were not built for the mountains. Their boots were improvised from pieces of the plain. Every step took effort. The snow broke under them. The altitude punished their lungs. At night, the cold came in waves so sharp it felt personal, but they kept moving because behind them were friends who had trusted them with their last chance. After days of climbing, they reached a high ridge and expected to see green valleys on the other side. Instead, they saw more mountains. Range after range of snow-covered peaks stretching farther than the eye could follow. For a moment, the sight nearly broke them. They had not climbed out of the Andes. They had only climbed high enough to see how trapped they really were. But in the distance, barely visible beyond the white, Nando saw a faint change in color, a small patch of green. It was not much, but it was enough. He told Roberto they would walk toward that green until they reached it or until they died. It was not a heroic speech. It was simply the last option left to them. For 10 days, they moved through the mountains. Their bodies were running on almost nothing. They stumbled, rested, stood up again, and followed water downhill whenever they could. Slowly, the snow began to thin. The air changed. The silence of the glacier gave way to the sound of a river, and then across that river they saw a man on horseback. They were too weak to shout over the water. So Nando wrote a note, wrapped it around a rock, and threw it across. The note said they were from the plane that had crashed in the mountains. It said they were starving. It said there were still survivors waiting in the wreckage. The shepherd read it, looked at the 2 men across the river, and understood he was seeing the impossible. The rescue that followed stunned the world. Helicopters reached the crash site and found the remaining survivors alive after 72 days in one of the most hostile places on Earth. They were skeletal, sunburned, traumatized, and barely recognizable. But they were alive. 16 people came down from the mountain who should not have survived at all. At first, the world celebrated them as miracles. Then, the full truth of their survival became public, and the reaction grew complicated. Some people were horrified, others were humbled. But the survivors themselves had no interest in turning their pain into spectacle. They knew what had happened up there. They knew the names of the friends who had not come home. The deeper meaning of this story is not just that humans can survive extreme cold, hunger, and fear. It is that survival sometimes comes with a cost. No outsider has the right to judge too easily. Those young men did not defeat the mountain because they were fearless. They survived because they were terrified, grieving, practical, faithful, and loyal to one another at the same time. In the end, the Andes did not simply test their bodies. It stripped away every comfortable idea they had about life, death, dignity, and choice. They returned to the world, but part of them stayed up there inside that broken fuselage in the white silence where the radio said they were dead and where they decided against every odd that the world was wrong. At exactly 9 in the morning on December 20th, 1973, in the historic heart of Madrid, Spain, a 69-year-old man named Luis Carrero Blanco was kneeling in a darkened, quiet pew toward the front of the San Francisco El Grande Basilica. To the few other worshippers scattered throughout the massive church, he looked like any other elderly devout man starting his day with a moment of spiritual reflection. The air inside the church was cold and smelled of old incense and melting wax, a familiar scent that Luis found deeply comforting. But Luis was far from an ordinary citizen. He was the Prime Minister of Spain and the hand-picked successor to the aging dictator Francisco Franco. In a country that had been ruled with an iron fist for decades, Luis was the second most powerful man in the nation, the man tasked with ensuring that the regime continued long after Franco was gone. He was a creature of habit, a man who believed that the strength of a government was reflected in the predictability of its leaders' lives, and his life was as predictable as the rising sun. For years, his morning routine had been the very foundation of his existence. He would wake up in his modest apartment, share a brief breakfast with his wife, and then step out into the crisp Madrid air to meet his driver. Every single day, without fail, he would be driven to this specific church to attend morning mass before heading to his office at the government palace. He found a sense of divine order in the liturgy, and he believed that as long as he maintained this schedule, the stability of the entire Spanish state would remain intact alongside him. On this particular Thursday, the service was no different than the thousands that had come before it. Luis listened to the rhythmic Latin prayers, his head bowed, his mind occasionally drifting to the complex political documents and military briefings waiting for him on his mahogany desk. He felt completely secure within these stone walls. Outside, the streets were patrolled by a hyper-vigilant secret police force, and the idea that anyone would dare to strike at the heart of the government in broad daylight was to him an absolute impossibility. Despite his immense power, Luis was surprisingly relaxed about his own personal safety, a trait that often worried his closest advisors. He refused to travel in the heavily armored vehicles that were becoming standard for world leaders at the time, preferring instead a sleek but vulnerable black Dodge Dart. The car was a symbol of dignity and Spanish industry, but it offered no protection against anything more lethal than a stray stone. His security detail was equally modest, usually consisting of just a single follow car with a couple of plainclothes officers. As the mass concluded, Luis stood up, smoothed his dark suit, and made his way toward the massive wooden doors of the basilica. The bright morning light of Madrid hit his face, and he shared a brief, polite nod with the priest standing at the entrance. He walked with a steady, purposeful gait toward his waiting car, his mind already shifting gears toward the business of the state. He climbed into the back seat, settling into the familiar, slightly worn scent of leather and old tobacco, and signaled to his driver, Jose Luis, that they were ready to depart. As the Dodge Dart pulled away from the curb, the city was just beginning to wake up. It was a beautiful, clear December day, the kind of morning that felt full of promise. However, as the car began its short 5-minute trip toward the palace, there was a tiny, nagging detail that had been present in the neighborhood for months, something that many local residents had noticed, but most had simply dismissed as a minor nuisance. For several weeks, a group of young men had been renting a basement apartment on Claudio Coelho Street, right along the Prime Minister's route. These young men had told the landlord and the neighbors that they were art students who specialized in large-scale sculpture. This explanation seemed to satisfy everyone, as it accounted for the fact that they were constantly hauling heavy, bulging bags in and out of the basement at all hours. They were always polite and soft-spoken, but they were also incredibly industrious. Neighbors often heard the muffled, rhythmic sounds of digging and hammering coming from beneath the sidewalk, a dull thumping that would sometimes continue well past midnight. Occasionally, a faint metallic smell of coal, gas, or the heavy scent of damp subterranean earth would waft up into the hallway of the apartment building. When one elderly neighbor gathered the courage to ask what they were building, the young men just smiled warmly and said they were working on a particularly large and difficult monument that required a very solid base. In a city like Madrid, where construction projects and building renovations were a constant part of life, nobody thought it was strange enough to warrant a call to the authorities. The truth, however, was far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. These students were actually an elite commando cell of the Basque separatist group known as ETA. They hadn't been sculpting art. They had spent months meticulously digging a long, narrow tunnel from their basement, extending it directly under the center of Claudio Coelho Street. It was a grueling, claustrophobic task carried out in total darkness and silence to avoid detection. They had to support the tunnel with wooden beams and carefully dispose of tons of dirt without being seen. By the morning of December 20th, the tunnel was complete. At the very end of the shaft, directly beneath the spot where the Prime Minister's car passed, every day at 9:15, they had packed a massive subterranean cavity with over 100 kilograms of high-grade industrial explosives. These weren't just simple bombs. They were shaped charges designed to direct the full force of the blast upward with terrifying precision. A long electrical wire ran from the explosives back through the tunnel and into the basement where the commandos waited. Inside the Dodge Dart, Luis was looking out the window at the familiar storefronts and the people sweeping their doorsteps. He liked seeing the same faces every morning. It reinforced his belief that Spain was a place of eternal order. The car turned slowly onto Claudio Coelho Street, a narrow one-way road lined with grand 5-story apartment buildings. The driver shifted gears smoothly, maintaining a steady, slow pace to navigate the tight corners and the occasional parked vehicle. There was a sense of absolute peace inside the car, a bubble of power. Just ahead, parked near a specific mark on the pavement, was a small, nondescript van. To a casual observer, it looked like it was simply waiting for a delivery, but inside that van, a man was watching the Prime Minister's car through a side view mirror with intense sweating focus. This man was the signal caller for the cell. He held a small radio in his hand, his thumb hovering over the talk button. He knew the Prime Minister's schedule better than Luis knew it himself. He had timed the car's speed down to the fraction of a second over dozens of rehearsals. The Prime Minister's car reached a specific spot on the road where the asphalt looked slightly darker, as if it had been recently patched after a water main leak. Luis didn't notice the patch, nor did he notice the man in the van suddenly speaking a single sharp word into his radio. In that heartbeat, the commandos in the basement apartment threw a heavy electrical switch. The peaceful morning was instantly shattered by a sound so profound and so loud that it felt like the sky itself was tearing open a roar that could be heard across the entire city. A massive, blinding pillar of orange fire and thick gray smoke erupted from directly beneath the Dodge Dart. The explosion was so powerful that it punched a crater in the street over 15 feet wide and nearly 10 feet deep. The force wasn't just a blast, it was a focused volcanic surge of energy that caught the 2-ton vehicle and treated it like a piece of crumpled paper. Witnesses on the sidewalk were thrown backward by the shockwave, their ears ringing and their vision blurred by a sudden cloud of pulverized concrete and dust. The physics of what happened next were so unbelievable that the first police officers who arrived on the scene actually thought the car had simply been vaporized. The explosion had launched the Dodge Dart 5 stories straight up into the air. The heavy vehicle carrying the prime minister, his driver, and a security officer soared over the roofline of the adjacent five-story apartment buildings. It cleared the top of a nearby Jesuit monastery, its wheels spinning in empty space and its metal frame glowing from the heat of the blast. Inside the car, for those few seconds of flight time, must have slowed to an impossible crawl. Luis and his companions were suddenly weightless, suspended in a chaotic swirl of shattered glass upholstery foam and the deafening echo of the blast. They were higher than the rooftops of Madrid, looking down on a city that was suddenly falling away beneath them. The vehicle reached the apex of its arc and then began its terrifying descent on the other side of the monastery wall, far away from the smoking crater where the journey had begun. The car didn't crash back onto the street or into the courtyard below. Instead, through a 1 in a million trajectory, it slammed down onto a second-floor interior balcony of the Jesuit monastery, coming to rest in a tangled, smoking heap of twisted metal and rubble. The impact was so severe that the car was crushed to half its original height, its engine block forced deep into the passenger compartment. For several minutes, a haunting, heavy silence fell over Claudio Coelho Street, broken only by the sound of car alarms and distant screaming. Dust and bits of debris rained down from the sky like a fine gray snow, coating the survivors and the rubble in a ghostly powder. The residents who rushed to their balconies looked down at the massive smoldering hole in the middle of the road, searching for the black car they had seen just seconds before. But the street was empty. It was as if the prime minister had been erased from existence by a bolt of lightning. The security detail in the follow car was in a state of total shock, their vehicle stalled and their windows blown inward. Inside the monastery, several monks were finishing their own morning prayers when they heard a rhythmic metallic thud coming from the upper gallery. They rushed toward the sound, fearing that part of their ancient building had collapsed. What they found was a scene that defied all logic. Resting on a balcony where only priests usually walked was a mangled, unrecognizable mass of black metal. It took them several seconds to realize they were looking at an automobile, and several more to realize that there were people still trapped inside the wreckage. When the emergency services finally reached the balcony, the task of extraction was a nightmare. The Dodge Dart was so badly deformed that the firefighters had to use industrial saws to cut through the roof. Luis Carrero Blanco was still alive when they first reached him, but his injuries were catastrophic. The man who was supposed to lead Spain into a new era died shortly after arriving at the hospital. The art students who had spent months digging the tunnel had vanished into the morning crowds long before the smoke had even cleared. The assassination, which the Basque separatist group ETA later claimed as Operation Ogro, remains one of the most daring and visually shocking political killings in modern history. The sheer audacity required to tunnel under a major city street and detonate a massive bomb right under the nose of one of the world's most feared secret police forces was unprecedented. The image of the flying car became a powerful symbol of the regime's vulnerability, proving that no amount of power or routine could offer total protection. In the aftermath, the Spanish government was thrown into a state of total chaos. Luis had been the only person with the political weight to keep the different factions of the dictatorship together. Without his leadership, the transition to democracy accelerated at a pace that no one had predicted. The wrong detail of the fake sculptors in the basement had not only ended the life of a prime minister, but it had effectively ended the era of the dictatorship itself, changing the map of Spanish politics forever in a single violent second. Today, Claudio Coelho Street is a bustling, fashionable part of Madrid, lined with high-end boutiques and quiet cafes. The crater has long since been filled, and the basement where the tunnel began is just another nondescript storage space. But if you stand on that sidewalk and look up at the high, ornate balcony of the monastery, it is impossible not to feel a lingering sense of dread. It serves as a permanent, silent reminder of the day when the ground opened up and launched the most powerful man in the country into the sky. It is a chilling testament to the fact that the routines we find so much comfort in are the very things that make us the most predictable to those watching us from the darkness. While the explosion in Madrid was a man-made eruption of fire that used the earth as a weapon 3 years earlier in Canada, the ground itself would undergo a much stranger and more terrifying transformation. In that case, there were no tunnels and no explosives, only a quiet neighborhood built on top of a hidden geological nightmare that was waiting for a single drop of rain. For the families living in the beautiful suburb of Saint-Jean-Vian, their daily routines were also their sanctuary, providing a sense of peace and permanence that seemed unshakable. They believed they had built their lives on solid rock, never imagining that the very foundation of their world was about to turn into a liquid graveyard. Just as Luis Carrero Blanco never saw the danger beneath the asphalt, these families had no idea that the silent, still earth beneath their homes was preparing to swallow them whole without a moment's warning. At approximately 7:30 in the evening on May 4th, 1971, in the picturesque town of Saint-Jean-Vianney, Quebec, a man named Leo was standing in his kitchen trying to finish up some light repairs. This town was widely considered a model of modern suburban living, nestled on a scenic hillside with a beautiful view of the Saguenay River. To the people living there, it felt like the safest, most stable place on the entire planet. Leo was a hard-working man who had moved his family to this newly developed neighborhood just a few years prior. Everything about the town was pristine. The streets were wide, the lawns were perfectly manicured, and there was a sense of prosperity that made everyone feel like they had truly arrived. But as Leo stood in his kitchen that evening, he was focused on a small, annoying problem that had been bothering him for the last several hours. He was trying to close one of the upper cabinet doors, but no matter how hard he pushed, the wood wouldn't sit flush against the frame. It was as if the entire kitchen had somehow shifted just a fraction of an inch. He took a screwdriver and tried to adjust the hinges, but the alignment was completely off. It was strange because this was a relatively new house. He shrugged it off as the house simply settling into the ground, something every homeowner deals with. Outside, the weather was miserable. It had been raining for weeks, a heavy, relentless spring downpour that had turned the surrounding fields into a soggy mess. The town sat on a massive plateau of clay, but no one really thought much about the geology of the land they lived on. They were more concerned with the beautiful views and the quiet streets. To Leo, the rain was just a nuisance that was keeping his kids inside and making the driveway a bit slippery. While Leo worked on his cabinets, his neighbors were also noticing things that felt slightly out of place. A few doors down, a woman noticed that her front door was suddenly sticking so badly she had to put her shoulder into it just to get it open. In the local park, a small sinkhole had appeared earlier that week, but the town council had simply put up a wooden barricade and promised to fill it once the rain stopped. It all seemed like minor, unconnected issues. The town of Saint-Jean-Vianney was built on what geologists call lait de clay, also known as quick clay. This substance is incredibly unique and terrifying. Under normal conditions, it is as solid and stable as any other soil capable of supporting the weight of entire skyscrapers. But quick clay has a secret. Its internal structure is held together by salt. When heavy rains wash that salt away, the clay becomes sensitive to any kind of vibration or sudden movement. If that clay is disturbed, once the salt is gone, it undergoes a process called liquefaction. In a single heartbeat, the solid ground doesn't just crack or shift, it literally turns into a liquid. It becomes a churning, high-speed river of mud that has the consistency of heavy cream, but the weight of liquid lead. And on this rainy night in May, the ground beneath the feet of 31 sleeping residents was reaching its absolute breaking point after weeks of saturation. Back in his kitchen, Leo finally gave up on the cabinet door and decided to sit down in the living room. The house felt unusually quiet despite the steady drumming of the rain against the roof. Around 10:48 p.m., a sound began to rise from somewhere deep underground. At first, it sounded like a low, distant growl, like a freight train passing through a tunnel miles away. Leo stood up, his heart beginning to pace as he looked toward the darkened window. The growl quickly escalated into a deafening metallic roar that shook the very foundations of the house. Leo grabbed his wife and children, telling them they needed to get to the car immediately. He didn't know what was happening, but every instinct in his body was screaming that the earth was no longer safe. As he stepped out onto his front porch, he saw something that looked like a scene from a nightmare. The streetlights were flickering and swaying violently. Just 50 yards away, the solid asphalt of the road was simply unzipping. A massive gaping crater was opening up in the darkness, and as Leo watched in horror, his neighbor's entire house tilted backward and slid into the abyss. There was no sound of crashing or breaking wood. Instead, there was only a sickening, wet, sloshing sound like a heavy object being dropped into a deep pool of cream. The house vanished into the hole in less than 5 seconds. The crater was growing at an impossible speed. It was eating its way toward Leo's front yard, devouring everything in its path. Trees, power lines, and parked cars were being swallowed by the churning mud. Leo threw his family into their station wagon and backed out of the driveway just as the front edge of his lawn began to crumble into the dark void. He could hear the screams of neighbors echoing through the rain, but the darkness made it impossible to see who was left. At that same moment, a large commercial bus was traveling along the main road leading into the neighborhood. The driver saw the road ahead of him simply disappear into the darkness. He slammed on the brakes, but the heavy vehicle couldn't stop in time on the slick surface. The bus slid over the edge of the newly formed cliff and plummeted into the churning river of clay below. The passengers inside were suddenly submerged in a cold, suffocating weight. The liquefaction event was massive. A section of land over 1,500 feet wide and 60 feet deep had simply turned into a river. This river was carrying 41 homes and dozens of people toward the Saguenay River at 30 miles per hour. People were waking up in their beds to find that their bedroom walls were gone and they were floating on a piece of floorboard through a sea of liquid mud. It was a geological disaster of a scale rarely seen. Leo managed to drive his family to the higher ground near the town church, which sat on a different geological formation. From there, they looked back at the neighborhood they had called home. In the flickers of lightning and the beams of flashlights, they saw a massive steaming scar in the earth where their street used to be. The silence that followed the roar was even more terrifying. There were no sirens yet, only the sound of the rain and the distant rushing of the mud. As the sun began to rise the next morning, the true scale of the devastation became clear. Where a thriving suburban neighborhood had stood just 12 hours before, there was now only a massive mud-filled bowl. The crater was so large that it could be seen from space. Rescue workers arrived to find that 31 people had vanished completely, carried away by the mud and buried deep beneath the surface of the river. Most of their bodies would never be recovered. The survivors were moved to temporary shelters, but they soon received news that was almost as devastating as the landslide itself. Geologists surveyed the remaining parts of the town and determined that the entire plateau was unstable. The government declared the town of Saint-Jean-Vianney a total loss. Every single resident was ordered to pack what they could and leave. The town was legally erased from the map, and the remaining houses were either moved or demolished. Today, if you visit the site of Saint-Jean-Vianney, you won't find any streets or houses. You will find a vast green field and a massive horseshoe-shaped depression in the land that has been reclaimed by nature. It serves as a haunting reminder that the ground we walk on is not always as solid as it seems. For Leo and the other survivors, the memory of that night remains a visceral weight, a reminder that the world can change from solid to liquid in a heartbeat. The families of Saint-Jean-Vianney lost their entire world to the invisible treachery of the soil beneath their feet, forced to flee as the very foundation of their lives liquefied and flowed away. It was a tragedy defined by the sudden, violent theft of a home by the earth itself. But thousands of miles away on a sun-drenched beach in Australia, another family would experience a theft just as sudden and just as absolute, though it didn't involve the ground moving. On that bright, windy afternoon at Fairy Meadow Beach, there were no roaring landslides or unzipping roads, only the cheerful sound of children splashing in the shallows and the smell of salt spray. The danger there wasn't hiding in the molecular structure of the clay, but in a tiny 4-minute window of time that allowed a different kind of monster to strike. While the people of Quebec watched their houses sink, a mother in New South Wales was about to watch her daughter vanish into thin air. At 1:30 in the afternoon on January 12, 1970, the air at Fairy Meadow Beach in New South Wales, Australia, felt like a warm, heavy blanket. The sun was a bright white disk in a cloudless sky, and the sound of the Pacific Ocean was a rhythmic, soothing backdrop to a perfect summer day. For 3-year-old Cheryl Grimmer, this was a world of pure magic. She was a tiny, energetic girl with a halo of blonde hair, and she spent most of her time that afternoon chasing seagulls and digging for buried treasure near the water's edge. Her family had only recently moved to Australia from England, seeking a life filled with sunshine and opportunity. To her parents, Janet and Vince, this beach was the ultimate reward for their long journey across the world. They felt like they had finally found a place where their 4 children could grow up with total freedom. The beach was crowded with hundreds of other families, all of them soaking in the holiday atmosphere. There was a profound sense of communal safety here, the kind of place where you could leave your keys on your towel and not think twice. Janet sat on a large striped beach towel, her eyes shielded by sunglasses as she watched her children play. She was a meticulous mother, always counting heads and making sure everyone was wearing enough zinc cream. Cheryl was never more than a few feet away from her older brothers, Ricky, Stephen, and Paul. The boys were protective of their little sister, often letting her join in their games, even when she was too small to keep up. In that moment, surrounded by laughing strangers and the scent of salt air, Janet had never felt more at peace with her family's future. However, as the afternoon wore on, the local environment began to signal a change that the immigrant family didn't yet know how to read. The horizon started to take on a strange metallic gray hue, and the wind, which had been a gentle breeze, suddenly died down completely. The silence was eerie, a brief pause before the arrival of a southerly buster. This is a unique weather phenomenon in New South Wales, where a cold front slams into the hot coastal air, causing the temperature to drop 20 degrees in seconds. It is a violent, beautiful, and very sudden transition. When the first gust of cold wind finally hit, it was like someone had opened a giant freezer door. The sand began to swirl in tiny, stinging tornadoes, and the cheerful atmosphere on the beach evaporated instantly. People began scrambling to grab their belongings before the impending storm arrived. Janet, seeing the sky turning an angry shade of charcoal, knew she had to get the children out of the wind. They were all dripping wet from the ocean, and she was worried they would catch a chill if they didn't get dry and dressed immediately in the shelter of the sheds. She gathered the kids and pointed toward the concrete changing block situated at the edge of the dunes just a short walk from their spot. She told her 3 sons to take Cheryl and go get rinsed off while she packed up the heavy gear. "Stay together," she shouted over the rising wind. The boys nodded, grabbed Cheryl's hand, and began the short trek across the sand. Janet watched them for a moment, seeing the 4 of them as a small, unified group against the darkening sky. She felt a slight prickle of urgency, but no fear. They were only going 50 yards away. The changing sheds were a low-slung, functional building made of drab gray concrete. Inside, there were separate sections for men and women with open communal shower areas at the back. It was a place where hundreds of people passed through every hour, a public space that felt utilitarian and safe. The boys led Cheryl to the entrance of the women's section. Ricky, the oldest, told her to go inside and wait by the showers while they went into the men's side to wash the sand off their own legs. They expected the whole process to take less than 2 or 3 minutes. Cheryl stepped through the doorway, her small feet pattering on the wet concrete. The interior of the shed was dim and smelled of chlorine and damp stone. Outside, the wind was now howling, creating a low, whistling sound through the ventilation slats near the ceiling. The brothers quickly ducked into the men's side, which was separated from the women's side by a single interior wall. They could hear the muffled sound of the showers running on the other side. They moved quickly, shivering in the cold air, anxious to get back to the warmth of the car and their mother. Less than 4 minutes after they had parted ways at the entrance, the boys stepped back out into the central walkway. They called out for Cheryl, expecting her to come running out with her towel wrapped around her shoulders. But there was no response. They called again louder, this time their voices echoing off the hard concrete walls. Silence. Ricky walked to the entrance of the women's side and peered in, being careful not to overstep. "Cheryl, come on, let's go!" he shouted. The only answer was the sound of a single dripping faucet somewhere in the back of the room. A cold knot began to form in Ricky's stomach. He signaled to a woman who was just entering the shed and asked her if she had seen a little girl in a bright swimsuit. The woman walked through the stalls and the shower area, but she came back out shaking her head. "There's no one in there, love," she said kindly. The boys didn't wait. They sprinted back toward the beach, their feet flying over the cold sand. They found Janet struggling with a folding chair in the wind. When she saw their faces, the sheer wide-eyed terror in their eyes, she didn't even have to ask what was wrong. Janet dropped everything and ran. She reached the sheds in seconds, her lungs burning from the cold air and the sudden surge of adrenaline. She burst into the women's changing area, ignoring any social protocol, and began tearing open the doors to every toilet stall. She checked the corners, the storage lockers, and even the small space behind the communal sinks. She was screaming Cheryl's name with such intensity that other people began to stop and stare. But the concrete room was utterly, heartbreakingly empty. Her 3-year-old daughter was simply gone. The next hour was a blur of frantic activity that felt like a nightmare occurring in slow motion. Dozens of people from the beach joined the search, forming a long human chain that moved across the dunes and into the scrubland behind the parking lot. Janet was hysterical, her voice cracking as she called out into the wind. Vince, who had been nearby, arrived and immediately began checking the water's edge, fearing the worst. The police arrived within 15 minutes, sirens wailing as they set up a perimeter. They were certain a child couldn't just disappear in such a crowded place. Investigators began to piece together the timeline, and this is where the mystery became truly chilling. Between the moment the boys left Cheryl at the door and the moment they returned, only about 3.5 minutes had passed. In that tiny window, a predator would have had to spot the child, snatch her without making a sound that her brothers could hear through the wall, and exit the building without being noticed by the dozens of people walking nearby. It was a feat of terrifying precision executed in a public space in broad daylight during a weather emergency. As the search expanded, the police brought in bloodhounds and helicopters with thermal cameras, but the storm that had rolled in began to wash away any potential scent trails or footprints. The southerly buster hadn't just brought cold air, it had brought a torrential downpour that turned the search area into a muddy mess. By midnight, the rain was relentless, and the hope of finding Cheryl nearby was fading. Every lead was a dead end. No one had seen a suspicious car, no one had heard a scream, and no one had noticed a child being carried away against her will. The Grimmer family stayed at the beach for days, huddled in their car, staring at the gray concrete shed as if they could force it to give up its secrets through sheer willpower. The brothers were crushed by a sense of guilt that would follow them into adulthood, the belief that if they had just waited one more second or held her hand just a little tighter, everything would be different. The police investigation eventually spanned the entire country, but without a body or a witness, the case slowly began to grow cold, settling into a permanent state of unresolved grief. For the next 40 years, the disappearance of Cheryl Grimmer remained one of Australia's most baffling cold cases. Her parents never stopped looking, keeping her bedroom exactly as it was on the day she vanished, a shrine to a life that had been frozen in time. They eventually moved back to England, unable to bear the weight of the Australian sun that reminded them of that day. Then, in 2016, a new task force using modern psychological profiling and digital records discovered a lead that had been buried in the original files since the very first week of the search. A man who had been a 16-year-old boy at the beach in 1970 was brought in for questioning. He had reportedly made several informal confessions over the years to acquaintances claiming that he had been the one to take Cheryl. He described how he had lured her away from the sheds and taken her to a secluded area in the bushland. The brothers felt a surge of hope they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in decades. It seemed like the shadow was finally coming into the light. A trial was set, and the world watched to see if justice would finally be served. But the legal system is built on specific rules of evidence, not just the weight of grief. During the trial in 2019, a judge ruled that the man's original confession from 1971 was inadmissible. At the time, he was a minor and had been interviewed without a lawyer or a parent, present a violation of rights that modern courts could not ignore. Without that confession, the prosecution's case disintegrated. The charges were dropped, and the man walked out of the courtroom a free man. The Grimmer family was left with nothing but the same silence they started with. Today, the mystery of Cheryl Grimmer remains an open wound in the heart of Australian history. It serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the most dangerous moments in our lives are the ones that seem the most mundane. A walk to the showers, a 4-minute gap, and a sudden change in the wind were all it took to erase a life and shatter a family's dream of a better world. Cheryl's brothers still visit the beach, looking at the modern changing rooms that replace the old concrete sheds, wondering if their sister is still out there somewhere, a ghost in the dunes. The story of the Grimmer family is a testament to the fact that some mysteries don't need a sprawling landscape to hide in. They can exist in the narrowest sliver of time imaginable. It is a haunting image of a child vanishing into thin air while her brothers were just a few feet away, separated by nothing more than a single wall of stone. While Australia struggled with the forensic vacuum left by Cheryl's disappearance half a world away in Montreal, a different kind of forensic miracle was about to prove that even the most silent buried secrets eventually find a way to speak. In that case, the answer wouldn't come from a witness or a confession, but from a microscopic code that had been waiting patiently for 48 years to be read. It would involve a young girl who, much like Cheryl, had stepped out into a familiar neighborhood with a simple plan, unaware that her path was about to cross with a different kind of shadow. The lessons learned in the dunes of New South Wales about the speed of a predator would find a terrifying echo in the autumn leaves of Quebec, where a cold case was about to be solved by mapping a killer's own bloodline through time. This bridge leads us from the sun-scoured coast of Australia to the crisp, leaf-strewn streets of Canada, where a 16-year-old girl named Sharon Pryor was about to embark on a walk to a pizzeria that would span nearly half a century of silence. The investigative genetic genealogy that eventually solved Sharon's case represents a new era of hope, a way to reach back into the darkness of the 1970s and pull the truth into the light, even when the person who committed the crime has long since returned to the earth themselves. At 4 in the afternoon on March 29, 1975, in the working-class neighborhood of Point St. Charles in Montreal, 16-year-old Sharon Pryor was standing in front of the hallway mirror in her family's modest apartment. She was carefully adjusting her hair and checking her reflection, making sure everything looked just right for a casual evening out. Sharon was a bright, responsible girl known to her family and friends as a bit of a homebody. She wasn't the type to go looking for trouble or stay out past her curfew. The neighborhood of Point St. Charles was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbors by their first names. It was a tight-knit community of brick row houses and local shops where children played in the alleys until the streetlights came on. For Sharon, these streets were an extension of her own home. She felt entirely safe walking the few blocks to the local pizzeria to meet up with her group of friends. It was a routine she had performed dozens of times before without a single second of hesitation or fear. Her mother, Yvonne, was in the kitchen when Sharon walked in to say goodbye. Sharon was wearing a distinctive light blue coat that her mother had helped her pick out. She promised to be home early, kissed her mom on the cheek, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was crisp with the tail end of a Montreal winter, and the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long golden shadows across the pavement. Yvonne watched through the window as her daughter waved and started her short walk toward the pizza shop. For the next 2 hours, the apartment was quiet. Yvonne went about her evening chores, expecting to hear the front door creak open at any moment. But as 6 o'clock turned into 7, a strange, heavy feeling began to settle in the pit of her stomach. Sharon was never late. She was the kind of girl who would call if she was going to be even 5 minutes behind schedule. At 7:15, the phone finally rang, but it wasn't Sharon. It was one of her friends calling from the pizzeria, asking if Sharon was still coming. The friend explained that the group had been waiting for over 3 hours, but Sharon had never shown up. In that moment, the peaceful atmosphere of the Pryor household was shattered. Yvonne felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. She knew instantly that something was wrong. Sharon hadn't just changed her mind or gone somewhere else, she had vanished somewhere in the few hundred yards between her front door and the pizza shop. Yvonne and her husband immediately grabbed their coats and ran out into the darkening streets. They spent the entire night searching the neighborhood, knocking on doors, and peering into dark alleys with flashlights. They spoke to neighbors who had seen Sharon walking toward the shop, but no one had noticed anything unusual. There were no reports of screaming, no sounds of a struggle, and no strange cars seen idling at the curb. It was as if Sharon had simply dissolved into the cool evening air. The police were called, and by the next morning, a massive search operation was underway involving hundreds of volunteers. The suspense of those first 48 hours was agonizing. Every time the phone rang, the family hoped for a ransom demand or a report of a sighting, but the line remained silent. Then, on April 1st, 3 days after she had disappeared, the search came to a devastating end. A man walking his dog in a wooded area in Longueuil on the south shore of Montreal spotted something blue in the melting snow. It was Sharon's coat. Her body was found nearby, bound and brutally assaulted. The neighborhood's sense of safety was gone forever. The police were able to collect a vital piece of evidence from the scene, a sample of biological material left behind by the killer. In 1975, DNA testing was still a decade away from being a reality, but the detectives had the foresight to carefully preserve the sample in a cold room. They hoped that one day forensic science would catch up to the brutality of the crime. For the next several years, they interviewed over 100 suspects, but without a physical match or a witness, the case slowly began to grind to a halt. Decades passed, and the file on Sharon Pryor became one of the most famous cold cases in Quebec's history. Her mother, Yvonne, never gave up. She kept Sharon's memory alive in the press and made regular trips to the police station to check on any new leads. In the late 1990s, when DNA profiling finally became a standard tool, the sample was processed. The detectives finally had a genetic ghost, a digital map of the killer's identity. They ran it through every criminal database in North America, but there was zero match. The killer was a phantom, someone who had seemingly committed this one horrific act and then vanished from the legal system entirely. The case sat on a shelf for another 20 years until 2022, when a new generation of cold case detectives decided to try a different approach. They turned to investigative genetic genealogy, the same technology used to catch the Golden State Killer. They uploaded the killer's DNA profile to public ancestry databases, looking for anyone who shared even a small percentage of his genetic code. After months of painstaking research, the genealogists found a hit. It wasn't the killer himself, but a cluster of distant cousins living in West Virginia. The detectives began the grueling task of building a massive family tree, mapping out hundreds of descendants across several generations. They were looking for a male relative who had been in Montreal in March of 1975. Slowly, the branches of the tree began to narrow down to one specific family with a history of traveling between the United States and Canada for work. The search led them to a man named William Romine. He was an American transient who had a long history of violent behavior and had lived in Montreal during the mid-70s. The wrong detail that finally locked him in was his employment records, which showed he had been working at a site near Sharon's neighborhood at the time of her disappearance. However, there was a problem. William Romine had died in 1982 and was buried in a small remote cemetery in West Virginia. To get an absolute answer, they would have to dig him up. In May of 2023, 48 years after Sharon waved goodbye to her mother, a team of forensic experts and detectives stood in that quiet West Virginia cemetery. They exhumed Romine's remains and took a fresh DNA sample. A few weeks later, the lab results came back. The match was absolute. The genetic code found on Sharon's clothing in 1975 was identical to the man in the grave. After nearly half a century of silence, the ghost finally had a name. The mystery was solved, but the man had already escaped earthly justice. For Yvonne, the news brought a complicated sense of peace. She finally knew who had taken her daughter, and she knew that the man could never hurt anyone else again. The story of Sharon Pryor is a masterclass in forensic persistence, proving that a single microscopic trace preserved with care can act as a bridge across time. It is a haunting reminder that while a predator can hide in the shadows for a lifetime, their own blood carries a record of their sins that can eventually be read by the future. The image of Sharon checking her hair in that hallway mirror remains the final heartbreaking snapshot of a life that was about to be interrupted by a transient shadow. Her case closed a chapter on a 48-year-old mystery using an invisible biological code to deliver a final truth to a mother who never stopped waiting. But while the threat in Montreal was a man hiding in the streets in the remote mission hospitals of Sierra Leone, doctors were beginning to realize they were facing a different kind of invisible killer. In those crowded, sweltering wards, the danger didn't have a face or a name, and it didn't leave a trail of DNA in the traditional sense. It was a microscopic predator that was jumping from patient to nurse and then from nurse to doctor, leaving a trail of violent, unexplained deaths in its wake. The struggle to identify this new threat would push the limits of medical science and reveal a biological horror that had been hiding in the village roofs for centuries, waiting for the right moment to emerge into the light. At 8 in the morning on January 20th, 1970, in a remote mission hospital in the town of Panguma, Sierra Leone, a missionary nurse named Laura Pineo was moving quietly between the rows of metal cots. The hospital was a small, sweltering collection of concrete buildings that served as the only medical lifeline for thousands of people living in the surrounding jungle. Inside the ward, the air was heavy with the scent of antiseptic wood smoke and the thick, humid heat of the tropical morning. For Laura, this was exactly the life she had envisioned when she left her comfortable home in the United States. She was a woman driven by a deep sense of purpose, and she found a profound beauty in the resilience of the local villagers who came to her for help. The routines of the clinic were predictable, treating malaria, stitching up wounds from farming accidents, and helping mothers through difficult births. It was a place of constant struggle, but to Laura, it was a place of absolute clarity and peace. As she reached the end of the ward, she stopped to check on a middle-aged woman who had been admitted the night before with a high fever. The woman was resting fitfully, her skin slick with a cold grayish sweat. Laura reached out to adjust the thin cotton sheet and noticed a small, unusual detail that didn't quite fit the typical profile of malaria or typhoid. There was a faint metallic smell hanging around the bed, and the woman's gums were weeping a thin, watery blood that wouldn't stop. Laura felt a slight prickle of unease, but she quickly dismissed it. In the bush, infections often presented in strange ways, and she assumed the patient was simply suffering from a particularly aggressive strain of a known illness. She used a piece of gauze to gently wipe away the blood, her gloveless fingers occasionally brushing against the woman's damp skin. She made a note to ask the head physician, Dr. Jeanette Troop, to take a look during her rounds, and then she moved on to the next cot. Within 48 hours, the atmosphere inside the Panguma hospital began to undergo a terrifying transformation. The first patient died in a sudden, violent surge of internal bleeding that shocked even the most experienced nurses. Then, another patient in the same ward developed the same mysterious fever. By the third day, Laura Pineo herself woke up feeling as if her bones were made of lead. Her throat was so swollen she could barely swallow, and her temperature began to climb toward a dangerous 105 degrees. Dr. Jeanette Troop watched with a growing sense of dread as her best nurse deteriorated before her eyes. Jeanette was a brilliant, meticulous physician who had spent years working in West Africa, but she had never seen anything like this. The illness seemed to be jumping from person to person with an invisible, predatory speed. It wasn't just a fever, it was a systematic collapse of the human body. The patients weren't just sick, they were being hollowed out from the inside their blood, losing the ability to clot entirely. The hospital, once a sanctuary of healing, was rapidly becoming a house of shadows. The local staff began to whisper about a curse, while Jeanette spent every waking hour in the small primitive lab staring through a microscope at blood slides that told her absolutely nothing. There were no visible bacteria, no parasites, and no logical explanation for the carnage unfolding in the wards. The silence of the jungle outside seemed to press in against the walls, as if the trees themselves were keeping a dark secret. As Laura Pineo's condition became critical, a desperate decision was made to evacuate her to a larger facility in Jos, Nigeria. Jeanette stayed behind, continuing to treat the growing number of victims, but the mystery only deepened. Shortly after Laura was moved, Jeanette was performing an autopsy on another victim, trying to find some clue to the killer's identity. During the procedure, her scalpel slipped just a tiny fraction of an inch and nicked her finger through her surgical glove. It was a wound so small it was almost invisible, but in that environment, it was a potential death sentence. Jeanette washed the cut thoroughly and continued her work, but the clock had already started ticking. 10 days later, the head doctor of the Panguma mission was dead. The news of Jeanette Troop's death sent a shockwave through the international medical community. 2 missionary nurses and a lead physician had been erased by a phantom that no one could see, name, or even begin to understand. Samples of the victim's blood were packed in dry ice and flown under high security to the United States, destined for the specialized containment laboratories at Yale University. The researchers there, including a world-renowned virologist named Jordi Casals-Ariet, knew they were handling something extraordinary. They worked inside sealed rooms, wearing heavy protective gear and breathing filtered air. They were the elite hunters of the microscopic world, and they were determined to bring this new predator into the light of the laboratory. But the virus was more resilient and more aggressive than anyone had anticipated. Despite the extreme precautions, Jordi Casal's Ariete suddenly fell ill with the same bone-crushing fever and agonizing sore throat that had killed the nurses in Africa. The lab was immediately locked down, and the university was gripped by a cold clinical panic. The researchers realized that the killer wasn't just a local African phenomenon, it was a highly contagious airborne threat that was now loose in a major American city. Jordi only survived because he was treated with a revolutionary high-stakes experimental therapy. He was injected with the blood plasma of one of the few nurses who had managed to recover in Africa. His body became a battlefield where the antibodies of a survivor fought a war against the invading phantom. While he recovered, the team at Yale finally succeeded in isolating the culprit. They saw it under the electron microscope, a strange, grainy-looking virus that looked like nothing they had ever seen. They named it Lassa virus after the village in Nigeria where the first recognized case had occurred. But knowing its name was only half the battle. They still didn't know where it came from or how it was entering the human population. An epidemiological task force was sent back to Sierra Leone, led by a team of virus hunters from the Centers for Disease Control. They moved through the villages with traps and sensors, looking for the natural reservoir where the virus hid when it wasn't killing humans. The truth was finally discovered in the most mundane of places, the thatch roofs of the village houses. They found that a specific species of common rodent known as the multi-mammate rat was carrying the virus in its body without getting sick. The rats lived in close proximity to humans, scurrying through the rafters and across the floors where food was stored. The virus was shed in the rat's waste, becoming airborne as it dried, and was inhaled by the people living below. The invisible killer had been a roommate for centuries. The discovery of Lassa fever redefined the way the world looked at viral threats. It proved that a completely new lethal pathogen could emerge from the most remote corners of the globe and reach a modern laboratory in a matter of days. It was a sobering reminder that the basic empathetic acts of nursing and medical care could be weaponized by a biological entity that had no sense of mercy. The missionary nurses had been the first to fall because they were the ones who refused to look away from the suffering. Today, Lassa fever remains a significant health threat in West Africa, claiming thousands of lives every year. The mission hospital in Panguma still stands a quiet monument to the women who gave their lives to solve a mystery they didn't even know they were part of. The story serves as a visceral warning that in the natural world, the most dangerous predators don't always have teeth or claws. Sometimes they are simply a microscopic code waiting in the dark for a single breath to change the world. While the doctors in Sierra Leone fought an invisible enemy that hid in the shadows of village roofs thousands of miles away in the rolling hills of Tuscany, a different kind of predator was preparing to emerge. This one didn't move through the air or hide in the dust, it moved through the olive groves on two legs, watching and waiting for the sun to go down. Much like the Lassa virus, this threat would turn a place of peace into a landscape of terror, proving that the most beautiful surroundings can mask a deep and lingering darkness. This bridge takes us from the sterile, high-stakes laboratories of the 1970s to the romantic, moonlit country lanes of Italy, where a young couple was about to pull their car over for a quiet moment alone. They had no idea that they were parked in the territory of a monster who had spent years perfecting his own silent, lethal routine. The shadow in the olive groves would become a mystery that paralyzed an entire nation, leaving a trail of questions that would haunt the hills of Florence for decades to come. At exactly 9 in the evening on September 14, 1974, in the rolling moonlit hills of Tuscany, Italy, a 19-year-old young man named Pasquale Gentlecore was steering his small white Fiat 127 along a narrow, unpaved country lane near the quiet town of Borgo San Lorenzo. Beside him in the passenger seat sat his 18-year-old girlfriend, Stefania Pettini, who was laughing at a joke he had just told. The air coming through the open windows was cool and carried the scent of ripening grapes and dry earth. To Pasquale and Stefania, these ancient hills were not just a scenic landscape, they were a sanctuary. They had been dating for several months and were deeply in love, the kind of all-consuming teenage romance that makes the rest of the world feel like a distant memory. Pasquale was a hardworking young man with a gentle face and a bright future, while Stefania was known for her striking eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Like many young couples in rural Italy, during that time their biggest challenge was finding a single moment of privacy. In the 1970s, Italian social life was governed by traditional family structures. Most young people lived at home with their parents and siblings until they were married, meaning there was very little space for a couple to be alone. This led to a widespread cultural phenomenon known as camperella. On any given weekend night, hundreds of couples would drive their cars into the secluded olive groves and vineyards that surrounded the cities, seeking a quiet spot away from the prying eyes of their neighbors and the strict rules of households. Pasquale knew this area of the Mugello Valley like the back of his hand. He turned the Fiat off the main road and onto a rugged dirt path that wound through a dense grove of silver-leafed olive trees. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the gnarled trunks and the tall, dry grass that stood waist-high on either side of the lane. He eventually reached a small grassy shoulder that overlooked a gentle slope. He killed the engine, and the world was suddenly plunged into a deep, heavy silence, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of crickets. For the first few minutes, they just sat there in the dark, watching the moonlight filter through the branches of the trees above them. The dashboard of the Fiat gave off a soft, griffin glow, and a local radio station was playing a low, melodic ballad that filled the cabin with a sense of peace. They felt entirely safe in this hidden pocket of the world. To them, the darkness wasn't a threat. It was a curtain that protected them. They spoke in hushed tones about their plans for the weekend and the lives they hoped to build together once they were older. However, as the night wore on, a very small and very subtle change occurred in the environment outside the car. The crickets, which had been a constant, steady wall of sound since they arrived, suddenly went quiet in the immediate vicinity of the Fiat. It was a microscopic detail, the kind of thing you only notice if you are looking for it, but the silence felt heavy and unnatural. Pasquale noticed it briefly, but he quickly dismissed it as the wind shifting or perhaps a stray cat moving through the underbrush. He reached over to adjust the volume on the radio. Then came the first real sign that something was wrong. There was a faint, rhythmic sound from the rear of the car, the unmistakable crunch of dry grass being stepped on by something heavy. It wasn't the frantic, chaotic rustle of an animal, but the slow, deliberate pace of a person trying to move without being heard. Stefania sat up, her eyes wide, as she peered into the side view mirror. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling just a fraction. Pasquale squeezed her hand, trying to reassure her. "It's probably just a wild boar," he said softly. He reached for the ignition key, thinking it might be better to just move to a different spot, but before he could turn it, a shadow blocked out the moonlight on the driver's side window. The silhouette was tall and faceless, standing perfectly still just inches from the glass. In the dim light, Pasquale saw the glint of something metallic in the figure's hand. There was a sharp mechanical click that echoed inside the small car, the sound of a hammer being cocked back on a firearm. Pasquale's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized they weren't alone. The silence was shattered by the deafening crack of a Beretta pistol. The glass of the driver's side window exploded inward, showering Pasquale in 1,000 tiny diamonds of light. Before he could even process the pain, the figure fired again and again with a terrifying clinical precision. The flashes of the muzzle lit up the interior of the Fiat in strobe-like bursts, revealing the attacker as a faceless phantom in the night. Within seconds, the car was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the heavy metallic scent of blood. The radio continued to play its soft ballad. The attacker then moved to the passenger side. He dragged Stefania's body from the car and into the tall, dry grass of the olive grove. What followed was a descent into a specific kind of darkness that would haunt the Italian police for the next 3 decades. The killer didn't just end her life. He performed a systematic, ritualistic mutilation that felt like a deliberate message to anyone who would find the scene. He used a sharp knife to leave behind a terrifying arrangement of her belongings nearby, as if he were constructing a private macabre shrine in the moonlight. As the sun began to rise over the hills of Tuscany the next morning, a local farmer was walking his dog along the lane when he spotted the white Fiat parked in the grass. He thought it was just another couple who had fallen asleep, but as he got closer, he saw the shattered glass and the dark stains on the upholstery. When he looked into the tall grass nearby, he saw the true horror of what had happened in the night. He dropped his walking stick and ran back toward the town, his screams echoing through the valley that had felt so peaceful just hours before. The investigation that followed was a masterclass in institutional paralysis. The local carabinieri arrived and processed the scene, but they were completely blind to the fact that they were looking at the official bloody awakening of a serial predator. They initially focused on local peeping toms and jealous ex-boyfriends arresting several innocent men, while the real monster watched from the shadows of the surrounding villages. They found several spent shell casings from a Beretta pistol, all of them marked with a specific unusual forensic signature, a tiny lead defect on the firing pin. The tension in the region began to skyrocket as people realized that a predator was hunting the romantic country lanes of Florence. The wrong detail that would eventually link this case to a much larger nightmare was that Beretta signature. When investigators looked back through the archives, they found a nearly identical crime from 1968 where another couple had been ambushed in their car. They realized that the monster of Florence, or Il Mostro, had been dormant for 6 years and had now returned with a newfound ritualistic intensity. For the next decade, the hills of Tuscany became a landscape of terror. The monster would strike 6 more times, always targeting young couples in secluded spots and always using the same Beretta pistol and the same ritualistic mutilations. The investigation became a labyrinth of conspiracy theories, botched arrests, and a shadowy group of men known as the Companions of Misfortune. The police spent years chasing ghosts, while the public's fear turned into a deep-seated distrust of the very institutions meant to protect them. The olive groves were no longer places of romance. The legacy of Pasquale and Stefania is a heartbreaking reminder of how a single night of violence can permanently alter the soul of a nation. They were just 2 teenagers seeking a moment of peace, unaware that they had parked in the private hunting ground of a monster. Their story serves as a chilling testament to the fact that the most beautiful surroundings can mask a deep and lingering darkness. The monster was never officially identified with absolute certainty, leaving the hills of Florence to carry the weight of his secrets long after the guns had gone silent. The image of that small white Fiat sitting alone in the moonlight remains the final haunting snapshot of a romance that was interrupted by a faceless shadow. The crickets in those hills still go quiet sometimes, reminding the locals of the night the monster first emerged from the trees. While Italy struggled with a killer who used the darkness of the countryside to hide his crimes across the world, in Singapore, a different kind of disappearance was about to prove that a person can vanish just as easily in the middle of a crowded, familiar neighborhood. In that case, the threat didn't involve a Beretta or a ritual, but a simple errand that should have taken less than 10 minutes. It would involve a young boy who, much like Pasquale and Stefania, was just going about his daily routine, completely unaware that his path was about to be crossed by a stranger in a car. The search for answers would span continents and decades, leading from a humid Singaporean street to the crowded alleys of a foreign city thousands of miles away, where a heartbreaking sighting would keep a family's hope alive long after the trail had gone cold. At exactly 6 o'clock in the evening on April 27, 1972, in the Lorong Engku Aman neighborhood of Singapore, an 11-year-old boy named Razlan bin Norman was standing on his front porch, adjusting the weight of a large wicker laundry basket. The air was thick with the heavy tropical humidity of a Southeast Asian twilight smelling of wood smoke, damp earth, and the savory spices drifting from nearby kitchens. For Razlan, this neighborhood was far more than just a collection of small houses and narrow lanes. It was a sanctuary of familiar faces and predictable rhythms. He was a bright, helpful child who took immense pride in his role within his close-knit family. His mother had just spent the afternoon washing and folding the family's clothes, and now it was Razlan's job to deliver the bundle to a shop just a few hundred yards down the road. He gave his mother a quick, cheerful wave, promising to be back before the rice was finished cooking for dinner. He stepped off the porch and began his short walk, his small sandals making a rhythmic, slapping sound against the warm pavement. The street was alive with the sounds of other children playing tag in the distance and the muffled clatter of dishes. To anyone watching it, was the most ordinary errand imaginable in a world that felt entirely safe. The walk to the laundry shop was a route Rosalind had taken dozens of times. He knew every crack in the pavement and every overhanging branch of the frangipani trees that lined the lane. As he walked, he hummed a popular song from the radio, the heavy basket balanced against his hip. He saw neighbors nodding to him as they swept their doorsteps, and he felt the comforting, communal hum of a village where everyone looked out for one another. As he rounded the first corner just out of sight of his front door, Rosalind noticed something that didn't quite fit the usual landscape of his evening walk. A car he had never seen before, a sleek, dark sedan, was idling quietly near the curb. In a neighborhood where most people walked or used bicycles, the presence of an expensive-looking vehicle was a small, shiny anomaly. The engine gave off a low, steady hum that seemed to vibrate in the humid air around him. He kept walking, his eyes fixed on the shop entrance just a little further ahead, but as he drew level with the car, the driver's side window slid down. A man was sitting there, his face partially obscured by the shadows of the interior. He leaned out slightly and called to Rosalind in a soft, polite voice, asking if the boy could help him find a specific landmark in the city. Rosalind, being a polite child raised to help others, stopped and set his heavy basket down. A younger child from the neighborhood, who was playing with marbles near a garden wall, watched the interaction from a few yards away. He saw Rosalind gesturing with his hands pointing toward the main road that led out of the district. The man in the car seemed confused and asked a follow-up question, gesturing for Rosalind to come closer to the window so he could see a map. It looked like a completely normal, helpful exchange between a local and a visitor. Then the wrong detail occurred, though the younger witness didn't recognize it as a threat at the time. The man opened the passenger door, and after a brief hesitation, Rosalind picked up his laundry basket and climbed inside the vehicle. The door clicked shut with a heavy final sound. The car didn't speed away, it simply pulled back into the lane and drove off at a leisurely pace, disappearing around the far bend toward the busier streets of the city. Back at the Norman household, the minutes began to stretch into a half hour, then an hour. Rosalind's mother checked the stove, the steam from the rice pot filling the small kitchen. She walked to the front door and looked out into the deepening purple of the evening, expecting to see her son's small silhouette walking back toward her. But the street was empty. A cold, sharp needle of anxiety began to prick at her heart, an instinct that defied the surroundings. She began to walk the path her son should have taken, calling his name in a voice that was initially calm but quickly grew frantic. She reached the laundry shop, but the owner looked at her with a confused expression. He told her that Rosalind had never arrived with the delivery. He had been waiting for the bundle, but the boy had never stepped through the door. The mother's legs felt like lead as she ran back toward her house, screaming for her husband. Within an hour, the entire neighborhood of Lorong Engku Aman had transformed into a sea of flashlights and calling voices. People who had been settling in for dinner abandoned their meals to search the alleys, the storm drains, and the dense patches of tropical brush. The younger boy with the marbles eventually spoke up, describing the man in the dark car and how Rosalind had climbed inside. The realization hit the community like a physical blow. Rosalind had been taken. The police arrived within the hour, their sirens a jarring new sound in the quiet district. They began taking statements, but the description of the car was vague, just a dark sedan that looked new. They set up roadblocks on the main arteries leading out of the area, but by then, the car had a massive head start. Every officer on the island was given Rosalind's description, and his face began to appear on the front pages of the newspapers within a single day. As the days turned into a week, a dark and terrifying cloud of urban folklore began to settle over the island of Singapore. Rumors began to spread like wildfire through the markets and coffee shops about something called galabai. This was a persistent post-colonial superstition that children were being kidnapped to be used as human sacrifices. It was believed that their blood or heads were buried in the foundations of new high-rise construction projects. These rumors created a climate of absolute panic. Parents refused to let their children out of their sight even in broad daylight. Groups of angry residents began to gather near construction sites, demanding that the workers allow them to inspect the concrete pours. The police were forced to issue public statements pleading for calm, explaining that there was no evidence of any such ritual, but the fear was a biological entity that could not be reasoned with. Then, the psychological torment of the family took a cruel modern turn. They began to receive handwritten extortion letters. One man, a prisoner already serving time in a local jail, claimed he knew exactly where Roslan was being held and promised to reveal the location in exchange for a large sum of money and a reduced sentence. The family, desperate for any shred of hope, cooperated with the authorities, only to find that the letter was a cold-hearted hoax. Every lead seemed to end in a brick wall. The detectives eventually identified a primary suspect, a man with a history of predatory behavior who matched the description given by the witness. They brought him in for questioning, certain they were on the verge of a breakthrough. But before the interrogation could be completed, the suspect was found dead in his holding cell. He had committed suicide, taking whatever secrets he held about that humid April evening to his grave. The death of the suspect was a final crushing blow to the investigation. Without his testimony, there was no way to know if he had acted alone or if he was part of a larger network. The car was never found, and the wicker basket filled with laundry seemed to have vanished from the face of the earth. The police files remained open, but the activity around the case slowed to a crawl as no new evidence emerged from the silent, darkened streets of the city. The investigation went cold, and the years began to pile up like dust. Roslan's parents never moved, fearing that if their son ever found his way back, he wouldn't know where to go. They kept his clothes and his schoolbooks a silent shrine to a boy who was frozen in the age of 11. Every time the phone rang or a stranger knocked on the door, their hearts would leap with a painful, familiar hope that was always met with the crushing weight of reality. Then, nearly a decade later, a family friend traveling through the chaotic, crowded streets of Bombay, India, saw someone who caused his heart to stop in the middle of a busy sidewalk. He saw a young man, roughly the age Roslan would have been sitting among a group of beggars. Despite the years and the grime, the boy's facial structure and a specific distinctive birthmark on his arm were an exact match for the missing boy from Singapore. The friend tried to reach him, screaming Roslan's name over the roar of the traffic and the shouting of the street vendors, but the boy seemed frightened and confused, looking up with eyes that held no recognition of his own name. Before the friend could push through the dense wall of people, the boy was ushered away by a group of older men and vanished into the maze of the city. It was a haunting, unconfirmed sighting that suggested a reality far darker. It suggested that Roslan had been trafficked across international borders, sold into a life of forced labor and misery thousands of miles away from the home where his mother was still waiting with a warm pot of rice. The sighting was never verified, and no other trace of him was ever found. The story of the laundry delivery remains a permanent scar on the history of the island, a reminder of how a single gesture can lead a child into a void from which there is no return. The Bombay lead was investigated by the authorities in both countries, but in a pre-digital age, tracking a single person through the sprawling slums of a foreign metropolis was an impossible task. The Norman family was left with the torturous image of their son being alive, but lost, unable to remember his own past or his own family. It was a grief that never healed a wound that remained open for decades as they wondered if he was still out there. Today, the neighborhood of Lorong Engku Aman has changed beyond recognition. The small houses have been replaced by the very high-rises that the rumors once claimed were built on sacrifice. But the story of the boy with the laundry basket is still told by the elders of the community, a cautionary tale that has become part of the city's DNA. It serves as a grim reminder of the day that a routine chore turned into a mystery that would span generations and continents. The image of that wicker basket abandoned somewhere in the back of a dark car remains the final agonizing snapshot of a childhood that was interrupted by a stranger's request for directions. Roslan bin Norman became a ghost in two different cities, a boy who walked into a humid evening and simply never walked back out. While Singapore searched for a child lost to the shadows of the street in a courtroom in France, a different kind of shadow was about to fall. In that case, the mystery wasn't about a missing body, but a piece of evidence that everyone could see, yet no one seemed to understand. It would involve a young girl who, much like Roslan, was just playing outside her home when a car pulled up to the curb. But the aftermath of that encounter would lead to a legal tragedy that forced an entire nation to look at the finality of their own laws. The red sweater left behind in a ditch would become a symbol of the truth's disappearance. This bridge leads us from the humid, crowded alleys of Southeast Asia to the stark clinical intensity of a French prison yard where the sound of a falling blade was about to echo across the entire continent. The search for a boy in Bombay would find a strange, tragic reflection in the desperate pleas of a man who claimed that the sweater found at a crime scene wasn't his. It was a moment where the justice system acted with a speed that nature reserves for the most violent of storms. At exactly 11 o'clock in the morning on June 3rd, 1974, in a sun-bleached housing project on the outskirts of Marseille, France, an 8-year-old girl named Marie Dolores Rambla was fully immersed in a game of tag. She was a vibrant, dark-haired child with a laugh that seemed to echo off the tall concrete walls of the apartment blocks. Beside her, her younger brother, Jean-Baptiste, was trying his best to keep up his small sandals, slapping against the warm pavement. The courtyard was a familiar, safe world where every neighbor knew each other's business. On this warm Sunday, the air carried the scent of roasting chicken and the faint saltiness of the Mediterranean Sea just a few miles away. Mothers leaned out of open windows to call their children for lunch, and the rhythmic clicking of bicycle chains provided a steady soundtrack to the morning. To Marie Dolores, this place was an absolute sanctuary where the only danger was a scraped knee or a lost ball. As the midday heat began to settle over the asphalt, a small gray car pulled slowly into the parking area near the children's playground. The vehicle sat idling for a moment, its engine giving off a low, vibrating hum that seemed slightly out of sync with the peaceful Sunday atmosphere. Marie Dolores stopped running, her chest heaving as she wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. She watched as a young man climbed out of the car and looked around, his eyes squinting against the bright glare. The man approached the children with a soft, friendly smile. He told them that he was looking for his lost dog, a small black poodle that had jumped out of his car just a few minutes ago. He seemed genuinely distressed, his voice trembling slightly as he asked if they had seen the animal. Marie Dolores, who had a deep and natural love for all creatures, felt an immediate wave of empathy. She wanted to help this man find his friend before the hot afternoon sun became too much for a small dog. The stranger suggested that if Marie Dolores came with him in the car, they could drive around the block and find the dog much faster. He promised they would only be gone for 5 minutes and that he would bring her right back to the concrete planter where she was playing. Without a second of hesitation, the young girl reached out and took the man's hand. She gave her brother a quick, reassuring wave and hopped into the passenger seat of the gray sedan, the door clicking shut behind her. Jean-Baptiste stood alone in the courtyard, watching the car pull away until it vanished around the corner. He waited for 5 minutes, then 10, then 20. The sun moved higher in the sky, casting shorter shadows on the pavement, but his sister didn't return. A strange, heavy silence seemed to fall over the playground. When their father finally came down to bring them in for lunch, Jean-Baptiste pointed toward the empty street and whispered that Marie Dolores had gone to help a man. The transition from a quiet Sunday lunch to a full-scale emergency happened in a heartbeat. Within 30 minutes, the Marseille police were flooding the housing project, their blue lights flashing against the white apartment walls. Neighbors joined the search, checking every basement stairwell and parking garage. The father's voice grew hoarse as he screamed his daughter's name, the sound bouncing off the silent buildings, but there was no answer from the shadows of the project. The first night was a descent into a specific kind of living hell for the Rambla family. As the Mediterranean stars came out, the police began to realize that this wasn't a case of a child getting lost. It was a calculated abduction in broad daylight. They set up checkpoints along the coastal roads, searching every gray car that passed, but the city was massive and the leads were thin. The only witness was a 6-year-old boy who could only describe a friendly man and a light-colored car. 2 days later, on June 5th, the search came to a devastating end in a remote, scrub-filled ditch near the village of Pépin, about 15 miles outside of Marseille. A local farmer noticed something bright and unusual tangled in the bushes. When the authorities arrived, they found Marie Dolores. She had been the victim of a violent assault, and her life had been taken. The news shattered the city's collective sense of security, turning the summer heat into a cold, biting sense of fear. Near the site where the body was found, investigators discovered a crucial piece of physical evidence, a large, bright red sweater. It was stained with mud and snagged on the thorns of the surrounding brush. At first, the detectives believed they had found a direct link to the killer. However, as they examined the garment more closely, a small but troubling detail emerged. The sweater was an adult size, but it was far too large for the primary suspect they would soon identify in the case. At the same time, miles away, a 20-year-old man named Christian Ranucci was involved in a minor traffic accident near the same village. He had crashed his car into another vehicle and then fled the scene in a panic. When the police caught up with him, they noticed that his car was not gray, but a distinct shade of Peugeot blue-gray that could look different depending on the light. Ranucci was a nervous, stuttering young man who seemed completely overwhelmed by the police presence. Ranucci was taken into custody and subjected to an interrogation that would become legendary for its intensity. For 18 hours, he was held in a small, windowless room without a lawyer or any contact with his family. The detectives, under immense pressure from a public demanding an arrest, hammered him with questions. They deprived him of sleep and food, repeatedly telling him that they had the red sweater and that witnesses had seen his car at the playground on that Sunday. Broken and confused, Ranucci eventually signed a full confession. He admitted to taking the girl and leaving her in the ditch. But as soon as the pressure of the interrogation room was lifted, he immediately retracted every word. He claimed that the confession had been dictated to him by the police and that he had only signed it to make the shouting stop. He insisted he was innocent, but the legal machinery of France had already begun its slow, irreversible grind toward a verdict. As the trial began, the wrong details started to pile up like a mountain of doubt. Several witnesses from the housing project were brought in to testify. When shown Ranucci's blue-gray car, the man who had seen the abduction shook his head. He was certain the car he saw was a much lighter shade of gray, almost white. Furthermore, the red sweater found at the scene was shown to the court. It was a bulky, oversized garment that Ranucci could barely fit into, yet he had no such item. The prosecution argued that Ranucci had used the sweater as a disguise or a cloth to clean his car, but they had no forensic evidence linking him to the garment. No hairs, no fibers, and no biological traces were found on the red wool. Despite the gaping holes in the story and the lack of a clear motive, the atmosphere in the courtroom was toxic. The public was out for blood, and the image of the innocent girl playing in the sun was too powerful for the jury to ignore that day. In March of 1976, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. Because of the nature of the crime and the signed confession, the judge sentenced Christian Ranucci to death by the guillotine. In France, at that time, capital punishment was still a legal reality, though it was rarely used. Ranucci sat in his cell for months, his face pale and his hands shaking, as his lawyers filed appeal after appeal, arguing that the evidence against him was entirely circumstantial and flawed. On the morning of July 28, 1976, the end came with a clinical, terrifying finality. At 4 a.m, the guards entered Ranucci's cell at the Baumetz prison. They told him his appeal to the president had been rejected. Ranucci, only 22 years old, had to be carried toward the courtyard. He was weeping his voice, a high-pitched whimper, as he repeatedly screamed that he was innocent and that they were making a terrible, irreversible mistake. The guillotine was waiting in the shadows of the prison yard, its tall wooden frame casting a long, dark silhouette against the gray morning stone. The executioner worked in total silence, his movements practiced and efficient. Within seconds, the heavy steel blade was released. The sound of the impact was a dull, metallic thud that echoed once and then faded into the morning air. Christian Ranucci was dead, becoming one of the last people to be executed in the history of Western Europe. In the years that followed, the red sweater case became a national obsession in France. An investigative journalist named Gilles Perrault wrote a book detailing the massive inconsistencies in the investigation. He pointed out that another man driving a light gray car and wearing a red sweater had been seen in the area around the time of the murder, but the police had never bothered to look for him. The doubt began to gnaw at the conscience of the entire French legal system. The execution of a man who might have been innocent became the primary psychological catalyst for a massive political shift. In 1981, France officially abolished the death penalty, a move that many historians link directly to the enduring shadow of the Ranucci case. The red sweater, once a piece of evidence, became a symbol of the irreversible finality of a flawed law. To this day, the Ramble family is left with the haunting question of whether justice was truly served. Today, the housing project in Marseille looks much the same as it did on that sunny Sunday in June. The concrete planters are still there, and children still chase each other through the shadows of the apartment blocks. But the memory of Marie Dolores and the young man who died in the prison yard lingers like a cold draft in the summer heat. The story is a grim reminder that when a society demands a quick answer to a horrific crime, the truth is often the first thing to be buried. The case remains one of the most controversial in European history, a legal tragedy where the wrong details were ignored in favor of a signed confession that was likely forced. It serves as a chilling testament to the fact that the tools of justice are only as reliable as the people who use them. The red sweater sits in a quiet archive somewhere, a silent witness to a truth that may never be fully known, a ghost made of wool that outlived the man who was blamed for wearing it. The image of Marie Dolores waving goodbye to her brother as she climbed into a gray car remains the final, heartbreaking snapshot of a childhood that was interrupted by a stranger's lie. Her story is a testament to the fragility of our safe worlds and the way a single piece of clothing can change the course of history. While France grappled with the finality of the guillotine across the ocean in Brazil, a different kind of legal battle was unfolding over a woman who had also vanished. In that case, there were no red sweaters or signed confessions, only a massive fortune and a lawyer who seemed to have a magical ability to make documents appear out of thin air. It would involve a beautiful socialite who stepped into her car for a routine trip and simply ceased to exist, leaving behind a trail of empty bank accounts and a judicial mystery that would last a decade. The shadow in Rio de Janeiro would prove that you don't need a blade to erase a life. Sometimes a pen is enough. At exactly 10 o'clock in the morning on June 29, 1970, in the high-end Leblon neighborhood of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, 48-year-old Dana Detefe was standing in the center of her master bedroom, surrounded by open luxury leather suitcases. The room was flooded with the bright golden light of a tropical winter morning, and through the tall windows, she could hear the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic surf just a few blocks away. For Dana, this was a moment of quiet, focused preparation. Dana was not just another wealthy resident of Rio, she was a fixture of the city's highest social circles. As the Czech-born former wife of a high-ranking diplomat, she moved through the world with an effortless, sophisticated grace that made her the center of attention at every gala and embassy dinner. She was beautiful, independently wealthy, and possessed a razor-sharp intellect that she used to manage her massive financial holdings and real estate empire. In the 1970s, she was the definition of Rio's elite. To the people who worked for her, Dana was a fair but demanding boss who valued order and punctuality above all else. Her mansion in Leblon was a sanctuary of polished marble, rare art, and impeccable service. On this particular morning, she was planning a routine business trip to Sao Paulo, a drive of about 6 hours. She had several meetings scheduled with her financial advisors and a few social engagements with friends she hadn't seen in months. Everything about the day felt entirely normal and predictable. As she folded a silk scarf and placed it into her bag, she checked her reflection in a heavy gold-leafed mirror. She saw a woman who was in total control of her destiny. She had recently been spending a significant amount of time with her lawyer, a charming and ambitious man named Leopoldo Heitor. Leopoldo had become a constant presence in her life, helping her navigate the complex legal landscape of her assets. He was efficient, polished, and seemed deeply devoted to protecting her interests in every transaction. Just before 11, Leopoldo arrived at the mansion in his sleek, dark sedan. He greeted the staff with a polite nod and waited in the foyer as Dana made her final preparations. There was a small, almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere as he stood there, a slight tension in his posture that wasn't usually there, but the staff dismissed it as the stress of a busy legal schedule. Dana walked down the marble staircase, adjusted her sunglasses, and told her housekeeper she would be back in 3 days. She stepped out into the humid air, the scent of salt and tropical flowers filling her senses. Leopoldo held the car door open for her with a practiced, courtly flourish. Dana settled into the leather seat, and as the car pulled away from the curb, she waved to a neighbor who was walking a dog. It was a mundane, cheerful departure, the kind of scene that happens thousands of times a day in a city like Rio. No one watching could have known that this was the last time Dana Detefe would ever be seen. The drive from Rio to Sao Paulo follows a winding, scenic coastal highway that cuts through dense patches of rainforest and overlooks the glittering blue of the ocean. It is a road filled with sharp turns and lonely stretches where the jungle seems to press in against the asphalt. For the first hour of the trip, the car moves steadily through the city traffic. Dana chatted with Leopoldo about a new investment opportunity, her voice calm and steady as she looked out at the familiar landscape of her adopted home. However, as the city lights faded and the road became more isolated, the tone of the conversation began to shift. Leopoldo started asking very specific questions about the location of certain original property deeds and the passwords to her private safes. Dana, who was usually very open with her legal counsel, felt a sudden cold prickle of unease. She noticed that Leopoldo was driving much slower than usual, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror as if he were waiting for something to happen. By sunset, the car reached a particularly desolate section of the highway near the town of Miguel Pereira. The jungle here was a wall of deep, impenetrable green, and there were no other headlights visible in either direction. Dana looked at her watch and realized they were significantly behind schedule. When she asked Leopoldo why they were taking such a long route, he didn't answer immediately. He simply gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles turning white in the dim light of the dashboard. The wrong detail occurred just as they passed a small rusted sign for a scenic overlook. Leopoldo suddenly pulled the car onto a gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal and the distant rhythmic chirping of jungle insects. Dana's heart began to pace against her ribs. "Why are we stopping?" she asked, her voice trembling just a fraction. Leopoldo turned toward her, and for the first time, she saw a look in his eyes. Back in Rio, the 3 days of Dana's planned trip came and went without a word. Her housekeeper, a woman who had worked for Dana for over a decade, grew increasingly concerned when the phone in the mansion remained silent. Dana never missed a check-in, and she certainly never missed a scheduled return. The housekeeper called the hotel in Sao Paulo only to find that Dana had never checked in, the room had stayed empty, and the reservation had been canceled by a man claiming to be her personal assistant. A week later, the mystery took a terrifying and public turn. Leopoldo Heitor walked into one of Rio's largest banks and presented a series of handwritten documents. The papers were signed by Dana de Tefe and granted Leopoldo full power of attorney over her entire fortune. He began the process of transferring millions of dollars and several luxury properties into his own name. To the bank officials, the signatures looked genuine, but the timing was impossible. The documents were dated July 1st, 2 days after Dana had vanished. The police were finally called, and the investigation into the socialite's disappearance became a national obsession. Detectives brought Leopoldo in for questioning, but he was a master of the legal system. He calmly explained that Dana had simply decided to leave her life behind. He claimed that she was tired of the social pressures of Rio and had asked him to liquidate her assets so she could live a secret, quiet life in Europe. He insisted that she had personally signed the documents in his presence before fleeing. The detectives didn't buy a word of it. They obtained a warrant to search Leopoldo's car, and that's where they found the first physical clues. Despite a thorough cleaning, forensic teams found microscopic traces of blood embedded in the rear floorboards. They also found a small broken piece of a gold earring that matched a pair Dana had been wearing on the morning she left. It was a visceral, chilling discovery that suggested the car had been the site of a violent struggle on that dark stretch of highway near Miguel Pereira. But Leopoldo remained unshakable. He challenged the police to produce a body, knowing full well that under Brazilian law at the time, it was nearly impossible to secure a murder conviction without a corpse, the principle of corpus delicti. He mocked the prosecutors, claiming that Dana was probably laughing at them from a beach in the south of France. The tension in the city reached a breaking point as the public watched a brilliant, manipulative, legal mind weaponize the very laws meant to protect the innocent. For the next several years, the case moved through the Brazilian courts like a slow-motion wreck. Detectives searched the woods along the Rio Santos highway for months using dogs and ground-penetrating radar, but the jungle was too vast and the earth too soft. They found several suspicious sites where the soil had been disturbed, but they yielded nothing but old animal bones. There were rumors that Leopoldo had used industrial chemicals to dissolve the body, or that he had buried her in a location that was now under a new concrete building. The suspense of the trial was defined by the absence of the victim. Dana's high society friends were called to testify, and they all painted a picture of a woman who loved her life in Rio and would never have walked away from her mansion and her friends. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence from the car and the suspicious timing of the documents, arguing that Leopoldo had executed a cold-blooded plan to steal a fortune, but without a body, the defense maintained a wall of absolute legal denial. The wrong detail that finally broke the case was a small mistake Leopoldo made in one of the forged documents. He had referenced a bank account that hadn't even been opened until after the date the paper was supposedly signed. This proved that the documents were fraudulent, which allowed the court to freeze the assets. In a landmark ruling in 1974, despite the absence of a body, Leopoldo Heitor was convicted of the murder of Dana de Tefe. It was a victory for justice, but a hollow one for those who loved her. Leopoldo was sentenced to a long prison term, but he continued to file appeals for decades, maintaining his innocence and even writing a book about the injustice of his conviction. He died years later without ever revealing the location of Dana's remains. To this day, the socialite's grave remains empty. She became a ghost of the legal system, a woman whose life was stolen not by a blade, but by a series of signatures and a dark car on a lonely road. Her story is a haunting reminder that power can be a mask for a predator. Today, the mansion in Leblon has been sold and renovated several times, its marble floors polished by new families who have no idea about the woman who once lived there. The case remains a foundational study in Latin American law, proving that truth can eventually prevail even when the physical evidence is hidden by the earth. But for the people who still remember the 1970s in Rio, the image of Dana stepping into that dark sedan remains the final agonizing snapshot of a life that vanished into a legal void. The mystery of Dana de Tefe is a chilling testament to the fact that you don't need a witness to prove a crime when the logic of the aftermath points to a single dark conclusion. She was a woman of status and wealth who was erased by the very person she trusted to protect her. While Brazil grappled with the legal ghost of a socialite across the world in Uganda, a different kind of erasure was taking place. In that case, the law wasn't being manipulated, it was being physically dragged out of its own sanctuary. In the high-ceilinged courtrooms of Kampala, the danger didn't hide behind fraudulent documents or coastal highways. It walked through the front doors in broad daylight, wearing heavy boots and carrying automatic weapons. The struggle there wouldn't involve a decade of legal appeals, but a single violent act of state-sanctioned kidnapping that proved even the highest judge in the land was not safe from a tyrant's shadow. This leads us to a morning in Uganda where a chief justice was about to face a power that respected no gavel. At 11 in the morning on September 21st, 1972, inside the grand high-ceilinged chambers of the High Court in Kampala, Uganda, a 50-year-old man named Benedicto Kiwanuka was sitting at his massive mahogany desk. He was a man of immense presence with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, deliberate way of speaking that commanded immediate respect. As the Chief Justice of Uganda, his life was defined by the steady, predictable rhythms of constitutional law. The High Court building was a majestic structure of white stone and polished wood, standing as a silent pillar of stability in a city that was increasingly feeling the tremors of political unrest. For Benedicto, this building was more than just his workplace, it was a sanctuary of logic and reason. Inside these walls, the only thing that mattered was the weight of evidence and the precise interpretation of statutes. He believed that as long as the law was upheld, the nation would remain whole. On this particular Thursday morning, the atmosphere inside the court was hushed and professional. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment floor wax and the faint, sweet smell of the gardens blooming just outside the open windows. Benedicto was focused on a stack of legal briefs, his fountain pen scratching rhythmically across the thick paper as he made meticulous notes in the margins. He found a deep personal peace in this routine, a sense that he was guarding the very soul of his country. Outside, the city of Kampala was a vibrant, noisy sprawl of markets and traffic, but the thick stone walls of the court filtered out the chaos. Benedicto's personal clerk, a young man who had worked for him for years, moved quietly through the office, organizing files and preparing tea. Everything was exactly as it should be. The schedule for the day was full of routine hearings and administrative meetings, the kind of predictable labor that Benedicto had dedicated his entire adult life to, perfecting. However, beneath the surface of this peaceful morning, there was a tiny, nagging detail that Benedicto had been trying to ignore for several weeks. The relationship between the judiciary and the military government of dictator Idi Amin had become increasingly strained. Benedicto had recently ruled against the state in several high-profile cases involving the illegal detention of foreign nationals. He knew that his independence was seen as a threat by the soldiers in the barracks, but he trusted the court. He believed that the black robes he wore were a shield, a symbolic barrier that even the most erratic general would not dare to cross. He had received several anonymous phone calls late at night, voices whispering warnings about his safety, but he dismissed them as empty intimidation. In his mind, the Chief Justice was an institution, not just a man, and institutions were permanent. He adjusted his glasses and took a slow sip of his tea, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. Around 10:45, a small but unusual change occurred in the environment just outside the main gates of the court. A dark, unmarked Peugeot sedan pulled up to the curb, its engine idling with a low, irregular thrum. Three men climbed out of the vehicle, wearing civilian clothes, simple button-down shirts and slacks, but they moved with the rigid, coordinated precision of trained soldiers. They didn't check in with the security desk or show any identification to the guards. The guards at the gate, usually so quick to challenge any unauthorized visitor, suddenly found a reason to look at their clipboards or adjust their caps. They didn't move to block the entrance. The three men walked through the arched stone doorway and into the main marble hallway of the High Court. Their heavy leather boots made a sharp, echoing sound against the polished floor, a sound that felt entirely out of place in a building where most people walked with a quiet, respectful gait. Inside his chambers, Benedicto heard the sound of those boots. It was a rhythmic, aggressive thud that seemed to be getting louder with every passing second. He stopped writing his pen, hovering just an inch above the paper. His heart gave a single, heavy thud against his ribs, and he felt a sudden, cold prickle of sweat break out along his hairline. He looked toward the heavy oak door of his office, waiting for the familiar soft knock of his clerk, but the sound didn't come. Instead, the door was thrown open with such violence that the brass handle slammed into the plaster wall, leaving a jagged white scar. The three men stepped into the room, their faces expressionless and their eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. They didn't offer a greeting or a legal warrant. One of them walked directly to Benedicto's desk and placed a hand on the mahogany surface, his fingers tapping a restless, impatient beat. "Chief Justice, you are coming with us," the man said. The voice was flat and cold, devoid of any emotion or respect for the office. Benedicto stood up slowly, his legs feeling strangely heavy and numb. He tried to maintain his dignity, straightening his tie and looking the man directly in the eyes. "On whose authority?" he asked, his voice steady despite the way his hands were beginning to shake beneath the desk. The man didn't answer. He simply reached out and grabbed Benedicto by the arm, his grip like a vice made of iron. The struggle was brief and heartbreakingly one-sided. The other two men moved in, grabbing the Chief Justice by his robes and his belt, dragging him toward the door. Benedicto's fountain pen fell from the desk and rolled across the floor, leaving a long blue streak of ink on the rug. His clerk stood frozen in the corner of the room, his face a mask of pure, wide-eyed terror as he watched his mentor being handled like a common criminal in the very place he was sworn to protect. As they dragged him through the marble hallway, Benedicto tried to call out to the lawyers and judges who were standing in the corridors. "Help me!" he shouted, his voice echoing off the high stone arches. But the people who had looked up to him for years simply turned their heads away. They stared at the floor or slipped into nearby offices, their faces pale with the realization that the rule of law had just been executed in broad daylight. The sanctuary had been breached. The men forced Benedicto into the back of the waiting Peugeot. As the door slammed shut, the sound was as final as a gavel hitting a block of wood. The car sped away from the curb, its tires screeching against the asphalt as it disappeared into the morning traffic of Kampala. The guards at the gate watched it go, then slowly returned to their posts, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. Inside the court, the silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. Benedicto Kiwanuka was never seen again. He was taken to the notorious Makindi military barracks, a place where the sounds of screams were often drowned out by the noise of running truck engines. Reports from the few survivors of that night suggest that he was confronted by Idi Amin himself, who was enraged by the judge's refusal to bend the law to his will. Benedicto was reportedly executed within hours of his abduction, his body destroyed or buried in an unmarked forest grave. The erasure of the Chief Justice was a turning point in Ugandan history. It signaled to the world that under the regime of Idi Amin, no one, not even the highest judicial authority in the land, was safe from the whims of a tyrant. The High Court remained standing, its white stone walls as majestic as ever, but the soul of the building had been torn out. The law was no longer a shield, it was a ghost, a memory of a time when reason mattered more than the barrel of a gun. To this day, the exact location of Benedicto Kiwanuka's remains is a mystery. He became one of the most famous of the disappeared, a man whose life was snatched away in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a routine morning. His empty desk and the blue ink stain on the rug served as a silent, haunting monument to the day the law lost its voice in Uganda. He had believed the sanctuary was permanent, but he learned too late that a temple is only as strong as the people. The image of the Chief Justice being dragged from his chambers remains the final, agonizing snapshot of a nation's constitutional collapse. It is a reminder that the institutions we rely on for safety are fragile things held together only by a collective belief in their power. When that belief is shattered by a heavy boot and a dark car, the silence that follows can last for generations. While Uganda mourned a judge lost to the state in the jungles of the Philippines, a different kind of phantom was emerging. In that case, the danger wasn't an aggressive military force or a lawless dictator, but the terrifying power of a single man's commitment to a war that no longer existed. It would involve a soldier who had spent 30 years hiding in the shadows of the banana trees, refusing to accept that the world had moved on without him. The struggle there wouldn't be about law or justice, but about the absolute haunting strength of a mind that had built its own reality out of silence and survival. This bridge leads us from the high-stakes political terror of Kampala to the humid, rustling silence of Lubang Island, where a young traveler was about to discover a man who looked like a ghost from a different era. The sound of a falling gavel in Africa finds a strange, rhythmic echo in the click of a pristine rifle bolt in the Philippine jungle. It is a story of a different kind of sanctuary, one built of isolation, discipline, and a war that refused to end even after the rest of the world had found peace. At exactly noon on February 20th, 1974, in the dense emerald green heart of the Philippine jungle on Lubang Island, a 24-year-old Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki was sitting by a small, crackling campfire. He was a curious, adventurous young man who had recently dropped out of college to travel the world with a very specific and somewhat eccentric checklist. He told his friends back in Japan that he was looking for three things: Lieutenant Onoda, a wild panda, and the abominable snowman, and that exactly. To most people in 1974, the idea of finding Hiru Onoda was a fool's errand. Onoda was a Japanese intelligence officer who had been sent to the island in 1944 with orders to stay behind and conduct guerrilla warfare against the Allied forces. The war had ended nearly 30 years ago, but Onoda had never come home. Most assumed he was a ghost, a myth, or simply a man who had long since perished in the unforgiving tropical terrain. But for Norio, the mystery of the soldier who refused to surrender was a siren song he couldn't ignore. The jungle around Norio was a wall of deep, vibrant green, filled with the constant, rhythmic buzzing of insects and the distant melodic calls of tropical birds. He felt a strange sense of peace in this isolated place, far away from the neon lights and crowded subways of Tokyo. He had spent 4 days trekking through the thick underbrush, calling out Onoda's name into the humid air. He had been told by the local villagers that a phantom lived in these hills, a man who moved like a shadow and left no footprints, but he hadn't seen a single sign of human life. As he reached for a piece of fruit he had gathered earlier, a very small and very subtle change occurred in the environment just behind him. The birds in the immediate canopy suddenly went silent, and the wind, which had been rustling the banana leaves, died down to a complete standstill. Norio felt a sudden cold prickle of unease on the back of his neck, the kind of primal instinct that tells you that you are no longer the only predator in the area. He didn't turn around immediately. He simply froze his heart, beginning to pace against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then came a sound that felt entirely out of place in a prehistoric jungle. It wasn't the rustle of a wild animal or the snap of a dry twig. It was the sharp metallic click of a rifle bolt being pulled back and locked into place, a crisp mechanical sound that belonged to a different era. Norio slowly raised his hands above his head and turned around. Standing just 10 feet away, partially merged with the shadows of the ferns, was a man who looked like he had stepped directly out of a 1944 history book, his eyes cold and fixed on Norio's chest. This man was Hiroo Onoda. He was emaciated, his skin pulled tight over his cheekbones, but he stood with a rigid military posture that 30 years of isolation had not been able to break. He was wearing a meticulously patched and cleaned Japanese Imperial Army uniform, and the rifle he held, a pristine Arisaka Type 99, was polished to a mirror shine. To Onoda, this young man in a t-shirt and jeans was not a traveler. He was a potential enemy scout, a new element in a war that in Onoda's mind had never actually ended. To understand how a man could stay in a jungle for 3 decades, you have to understand the absolute terrifying power of psychological conditioning. In December of 1944, Onoda's commanding officer had given him a very specific set of orders. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens will come back for you. Until then, as long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead them. Onoda was a man of his word, and he took those orders as a sacred eternal vow. For the first few years after the war ended in 1945, Onoda wasn't alone. He had 3 other soldiers with him, and together they waged a small, lethal guerrilla campaign against the local farmers and the occasional police patrol. They believed they were protecting the island for the inevitable return of the Japanese fleet. When they found airdropped leaflets and newspapers announcing that Japan had surrendered, they didn't feel relief. Instead, they felt a deep, cynical suspicion. They examined the paper and the ink, convinced it was an elaborate American hoax. They told themselves that the Japanese government would never surrender, and therefore any evidence to the contrary must be a psychological operation designed to lure them out of the hills. When they found letters from their own families and photos of their siblings, they looked at the wrong details, a change in a sister's hairstyle or a brand of clothing they didn't recognize, and concluded that the enemy had hired actors to impersonate their loved ones. They retreated further into the mountains, living in a fortress built of cognitive bias and absolute discipline. One by one, Onoda's companions were lost. One surrendered in 1950, and the other 2 were killed in skirmishes with local police while they were raiding farms for food. By 1972, Hiroo Onoda was the last ghost of Lubang Island. He lived in a state of constant high-alert survival. He moved his camp every night, slept in snatches of 2 hours at a time, and kept his rifle and his 50 rounds of ammunition in better condition than his own body. He survived on bananas, coconut milk, and the occasional stolen cow, his mind a steel trap of military logic. Every sound in the jungle was a data point. The hum of a distant airplane wasn't a commercial flight, it was a reconnaissance mission. The sound of a chainsaw in the valley wasn't a logger, it was the enemy building a base. Onoda had constructed a complete alternate reality where the world was still locked in a global conflict, and he was the sole defender of a tiny, forgotten front. He felt a sense of purpose that gave him the strength to endure the monsoon rains, the sweltering heat, and the crushing loneliness that would have broken any other man. When he finally confronted Norio Suzuki in that jungle clearing, Onoda was prepared to fire. But Norio did something that the search parties and the military groups had never done. He didn't try to capture Onoda or force him to surrender. He simply sat down and began to talk. He told Onoda about modern Japan, about the skyscrapers, the televisions, and the peace that had lasted for 30 years. He spoke with a gentleness and a sincerity that finally, for the first time in 3 decades, caused a small crack to appear in the soldier's psychological armor. Norio spent the night with Onoda, the 2 men sitting by the fire as the jungle breathed around them. Onoda listened to the stories of a world he didn't recognize, his fingers still tracing the cold steel of his rifle. He began to realize that this young man knew things about his family that an enemy scout could not possibly know. But even then, the discipline was too strong. Onoda told Norio that he could not surrender. He said that he was a soldier under orders, and until his commanding officer personally told him to stop, he would stay on that island until he died. The wrong detail in Onoda's life was that he was waiting for a man who had long since become a civilian. Norio returned to Japan and tracked down Onoda's original commander, Major Taniguchi, who was now a quiet old man running a neighborhood bookstore. They flew back to Lubang Island together, and on March 9th, 1974, they hiked into the hills. The major was wearing his old military coat, looking like a relic from a forgotten century. He stood in a small clearing and read a formal order to Onoda, relieving him of all military duties and responsibilities. The climax of the story is a moment of profound, quiet tragedy. Onoda stood perfectly still as the words washed over him. He realized in that heartbeat that the last 30 years of his life, the hunger, the killing, the constant fear, and the absolute isolation had been for a war that had been over before he was even 25. He didn't scream or rage. He simply reached out and handed his pristine samurai sword to the major, his eyes filling with tears that he had not allowed himself to shed since 1944. He saluted one last time and walked out of the trees. The transition from the jungle to the modern world was a second, slower kind of trauma. Onoda returned to Japan as a national hero, but he found the country unrecognizable. The values of duty, honor, and sacrifice that he had lived by had been replaced by consumerism and a fast-paced urban lifestyle that made him feel like an alien. He eventually moved to Brazil to start a ranch, seeking the quiet and the space of the frontier, before finally returning to Japan to open a school for children, teaching them the survival skills that had kept him alive in the shadows of Lubang. The story of Hiroo Onoda is a haunting psychological profile of extreme dedication and the terrifying power of the human mind to create its own reality. He was a man who lived as a phantom for 30 years, a soldier who had spent the prime of his life protecting a landscape that no one wanted to take. His life serves as a visceral reminder that the wars we fight inside our own heads are often far more dangerous than the ones fought with guns. He had survived the jungle, but he would always carry the silence of those 30 years within him, a ghost who finally came home. The image of Onoda polishing his rifle in the moonlight, unaware that the world had found peace decades ago, remains the final haunting snapshot of a life that was interrupted by a sacred vow. He was a man of the past who had been forced to live in a future he didn't want, a soldier who had won every battle except the one against time. His story concludes our journey through the 1970s, a decade where the lines between reality and mystery were often as thin as the veil of the tropical jungle, leaving us with a chill that doesn't go away once the fire dies. Down. These 12 stories, from the frozen peaks of the Andes to the silent olive groves of Italy and the humid streets of Singapore, remind us that the world is a fragile, unpredictable place. We live our lives in routines and safe spaces, believing that the ground is solid and the law is a shield, but as we've seen, the shadows are always watching, waiting for a single moment of vulnerability. The mysteries we've explored tonight are the echoes of lives that were suddenly and violently changed, leaving behind a trail of questions that still haunt the corners of our collective memory. As you prepare to turn off your lights and head to bed, take a moment to look around your own sanctuary. Check the locks on your doors one more time. Make sure your windows are latched tight. Listen to the silence of your house and wonder if there is a sound that doesn't quite belong, or a shadow in the corner that wasn't there before. The world is full of strange, dark, and mysterious things, and sometimes the only difference between a normal night and a story, like the ones you've heard tonight, is a single 4-minute window of time. Stay safe out there. What makes these cases from the early 1970s so uniquely disturbing is the absolute silence that followed the disappearances. In a world before cell phones and constant digital surveillance, when someone vanished, they truly went into a void. We are left staring at the last mundane moments, a girl waving goodbye or a boy carrying a laundry basket, and realize that those ordinary actions were actually the final scenes of their lives. There is a visceral kind of fear that comes from the physical objects left behind in these mysteries. A wicker basket abandoned on a street, a red sweater snagged on a thorn, or a mangled car sitting on a monastery balcony. These items become anchors for our grief because they are so ordinary, and yet they represent a total collapse of the world as we knew it. They remind us that the physical world remains even when the people we love are suddenly gone. These events reflect a society that was beginning to lose its collective sense of security during a period of massive transition. We see a world where the monsters were no longer just distant figures in headlines, but people hiding in olive groves or standing in the hallways of high courts. These stories show us that no amount of status or routine can truly insulate us from a world that is occasionally chaotic and cruel. It reflects our deep-seated need to find order. We also see a fascinating reflection of how we value the truth across different cultures and legal systems. From the execution of a man in France based on a questionable confession to the decades-long hunt for a killer in Montreal society is constantly struggling to balance the desire for justice with the reality of human error. It shows a world that was becoming more aware of its own flaws, even as it desperately tried to protect the most vulnerable among us. The institutional paralysis seen in the hills of Tuscany or the high courts of Uganda reveals a darker truth about the structures we build to protect ourselves. When the very people sworn to uphold the law are the ones being dragged away or making catastrophic errors, the sense of dread becomes a collective experience. It reflects the realization that we are often at the mercy of systems that are just as fragile and fallible as the individuals who run them. There is also a profound reflection on the nature of isolation, whether it is the physical isolation of a glacier in the Andes or the psychological isolation of a soldier in the Philippine jungle. These stories show us that the human mind can adapt to almost anything, creating its own reality just to survive. It reflects our incredible capacity for resilience, but also warns us about how easily we can lose touch with the world if we are left alone for too long. The lasting message of these cases is found in the incredible endurance of the human spirit and the relentless persistence of the truth. Even after 72 days in the freezing Andes or 48 years of silence in a Canadian cold case, the human drive to survive and to find answers never truly flickers out. These stories remind us that while we are fragile creatures, our voices and our names have a way of outliving the darkness that tries to erase them. As we look back from the present, there is a sense of hope that did not exist when these crimes first occurred. The fact that we can now use a single drop of blood to reconstruct a family tree and find a killer 4 decades later changes the narrative from one of total loss to one of eventual resolution. It tells us that time does not have to be an enemy of justice. The truth is a patient thing waiting in the cold and the dark for the technology to finally catch up. Ultimately, we are left with the understanding that every life is connected by a very thin thread to the world around us. We must appreciate the quiet, boring moments of our routines because those are the very things that define a life of peace. The cases of the 1970s serve as a permanent lighthouse, warning us about the shadows, while also celebrating the bravery of those who continue to look for the light. We tell these stories so the missing are not forgotten. We must also confront the reality that for some families, the closure never comes. The empty grave of a socialite in Brazil or the unconfirmed sighting of a boy in a foreign city represents a specific kind of enduring pain that has no expiration date. These stories teach us about empathy and the importance of remembering those who have been lost to the silence. It is a reminder to hold on to the people we love and to never take a simple walk to the store for granted. As you move back into your own life, carry the lessons of these ghosts with you. Let the strength of the survivors inspire you and let the mysteries of the lost keep you vigilant. We tell these stories not to glorify the darkness, but to honor the light that was taken too soon. The past is never truly dead as long as there is someone left to listen to its echoes. Take a breath, appreciate the safety of your own room, and remember that every story deserves to be finished.